For this panel, I'm delighted to be joined by 4 esteemed guests, starting with Michiko Suga. She's the European Office Representative of the Asian Development Bank. Peter Oswald is here as well with us, the CEO of the Group. Sophie Andersen, the Lord Mayor of Copenhagen, is also with us in Paris today. And last but not least, Ilse Henne, the Executive Board Member of thyssenkrupp. Lovely to see you all.
Thank you.
Peter Oswald, blessed among women there.
Yes.
On today's panel. It should be feisty, I'm sure. What we've heard today is we need to move faster. The science is clear. Everyone in this room is perfectly aware of what is at stake. Maxwell Weiss as well was very clear in his opening remarks as well. But what one system level barrier most needs overcoming, do you think, to finance and deploy climate solutions at the pace that is required? Perhaps as we start with you?
Oh, it's always difficult to name one. We heard many already in the panel just before us. I think it's always a balance between what do we need to do as an industry amongst us? How can we build networks that anticipate the transition and the investment that it needs into the transition on the one side, and on the other hand, of course, it also needs the right policies. It needs the right setting for industry policy. I think we need to rethink, especially for us as a steel producer, of course, what do we do in terms of trade, defense, etc. So it's very multifaceted. But it's always a combination between building networks, as we already heard in the earlier panel, and then setting the right tone by policymakers.
Indeed, it's always about finding that combination, if you like. Let's bring in now your perspective from the Asian Development Bank on that question.
I think the simple answer is we need good projects, implementable projects and scalable projects, and we're talking about moving the money, and it's one important aspect to catalyze the money, to have the enabling environment to catalyze money, but it's also important, equally important, to have projects that are implementable, that address sustainability, that address the climate, and that address nature, and it's not always straightforward.
Yeah. No. It is not always straightforward. That is why we're here together trying to find solutions all together. Peter, you are the CEO of the largest carton board producer in the whole of Europe. So what would your perspective be on this challenge? What needs to change in our economic system if we really want to reach those targets of net zero?
Yeah, I see there is still a hesitation to give the right incentives. And I just give 2 examples. Let's say in Poland, we invest now in renewable energy. So we have 2 projects. One was in renewable energy. The other one is simply expanding our production. Today, we don't see any difference in terms of, for the one we get a subsidy, for the other we get no subsidy. For the one we get, let's say, a long-term cheaper loan. For the other, we don't get it. They're equally treated. So you get the dilemma as a manager to say if the one project is a 15% return project and the other one is a 20% project, you should do the 20% project, but the 15% project is the one about renewable energy, where we say we already have 68% and we want now to go to 80%, for instance. Another example, I was really admiring the European Parliament when they passed this plastic tax, where they said there are so much environmental costs associated with plastic in the ocean, etc. So we put a tax on it. But of course, the tax should be paid by those who originate it. And then no government dared to implement it. So we all, our company, which is no plastic, pays taxes for plastic, and we all as ordinary citizens pay for it. And I think there, and I was asking our environmental minister in Austria, so yeah, and she said, yeah, lobby is too strong. And if you don't give the right incentives, it's very difficult just to appeal to people to make decisions where there are no incentives or no punishment, so to say. So there we need to get more, have more courage.
Okay, very interesting point there from Peter. Same question to you from the perspective of being the mayor of Copenhagen.
Well, I think that for many, many years in Copenhagen, we have managed to finance climate adaptation plans in public-private sharing and sharing of the risks. And we also had a government that said that it was okay for us to do investments in renewable energies and use tariffs as a system for the people who get district heating or get the energy out of it, that they could actually pay for some of these investments. So far, so good. But now we are moving into new territory. We're going to make a new climate action plan, and we're going to look at the Copenhageners, the footprints of the Copenhageners. And what we see is that, for instance, the built environment, when it comes to our city and how we need to renew our city all the time, at the same time having even more Copenhageners, now it's getting pretty difficult, because if we build a school where we reuse the buildings and where we reuse the materials instead of using up new resources all the time, it's going to be more expensive. And who is going to pay for that? In all cities around the globe, we see the cost of living is rising, and especially on the market of housing. And now we come here and we say, and you need to reuse, and you need to be more aware of the energy that you're using, and you need to do the investments, but sometimes the investments make the housing 10% more expensive. And that is very difficult to work with in the cities. So I don't have all the answers today, but I'm just saying that when it comes to climate crisis, cost of living, we need to find a way into how do we manage to move forward.
That's the reality on the ground, that you're painting a perfectly clear picture of your city, a similar conundrum for cities all across the continent. You mentioned what's keeping you up at night, Peter Oswald, and what you dislike. But what about policy networks and specific changes in markets and policy frameworks that could accelerate your transition investments?
It's actually what I said before. It's incentives. You have to, if you want people to change, of course you can appeal to them. And we heard the example from our valued customer Hæstorp, that you say, I just absorb more costs and make it happen. But you could have incentives, both positive and negative. I mean, we are used to it. If we go to the petrol station, we pay not so much for the petrol, but we mainly pay taxes. And that's right, because we want to avoid it, and it's one way to steer it. And that should be used more. But of course it's difficult, because in a democracy you want to be elected, so you have always interest groups who defend their interests. But it is all about incentives, making the right incentives. And it's good, for instance, that the CO2 price is where it is, and it should be 100. That's actually what we calculate for all our capex, because then we can justify to do something against it. If the costs fell tomorrow to 10, then it's more difficult. You still want to do it as a company, but it's difficult to justify it.
Ilse, what about you? Any specific policy frameworks?
I think it's of course about incentives, but I think what is even more important is that we understand that in order to create what I call an industrialized but decarbonized Europe, we're going to need to focus on building other kinds of networks. Yeah? There is nobody who can industrialize or decarbonize this industry on its own, in its own industry. I think we really need to cooperate. Looking for us, for example, at our steel mill, we need green hydrogen. Yeah? And we cannot for green hydrogen, we need a lot of green electricity. And we cannot create this green energy ourselves. We need to cooperate with other companies. We can offer stability in demand, and then you need an infrastructure being built. Incentives can help, but I still see that very often we try to solve the problems in a too isolated way.
And why is there not more cooperation? What's hindering it?
Well, I think it's about thinking it's about thinking in new ways, of course, so we need to overcome some biases that we have, but of course it's also about each of us building sustainable economies, sustainable in the way that we need to make money also with our green business models. So there is always a trade-off that is on the table, and I think next to incentives, wanting to overcome this trade-off and thinking more long-term is definitely also what we need.
More long-term thinking, indeed. And just when it comes to development banks, what role can they play here in funding or in putting up funding to signal investors towards projects that are, of course, beneficial for society and for the climate?
I think staying in line with what we just talked about, in addition to incentives, we need to address the risks that exist. So today we've spoken a lot about Europe. I am from the Asian Development Bank, so we represent the Asian Pacific countries. And there we talk a lot about how we can de-risk the situation, how we can create an enabling environment. So there are political risks, there are financial risks, there are implementation capacity risks. So all of these, and each country, each sector, each region is different. So there's no one fits for all response. We have to have a tailored approach to each of these situations. So what we do is we address and work together with governments to address the risks that are there in order to create an environment that's enabling for the private sector to come in. That's the incentive, to create the incentives or create the environment where governments can create the incentives for the private sector to come in. And then we talked about cooperation. I'd like to use an example from the Philippines. Many Asian countries, including Philippines and Vietnam, they're moving towards offshore wind. So there's a lot of knowledge and technology that's present in Europe that can be used in these situations, that can be applied for a lot of opportunities for European companies. And one bottleneck, amongst many bottlenecks, is of course the policy environment. So the Philippines is working towards having a policy environment to enable offshore wind to be a possibility. But then there's one bottleneck that is not a straightforward bottleneck. It is, even though the Philippines has a lot of ports, none of the ports are big enough for a ship to dock that carries the blades in order to have an offshore wind farm. So you would have to also address the infrastructure problem. So I think we talked a lot about cooperation, and I think what that also entails is cooperating across sectors, across disciplines, and with partners that traditionally might not have been a partner. Mm.
Could you weigh in there perhaps with some advice on how to promote this cooperation?
Well, in Copenhagen, we are a member of C40, and that's an international mayors forum where we work together in partnerships. And for the last couple of years, Copenhagen has been working very closely with Buenos Aires, for instance, on reducing public energy, energy in public buildings. We've been working with them how to do even more green city developments, and now we're moving on to Johannesburg and also Sao Paulo. So these are some of the ways that we can knowledge share, that we can use each other as a means of innovation and scale up things that has been working in one part of the world and trying to do that with other parts of the world in itself. But I must also say, when it comes to Copenhagen in itself, I also see partnerships as a very important thing. In Copenhagen, in the Copenhagen area, we made the Energy Leap partnership the network, where we worked very closely together with the companies, both public and private, when it comes to energy and energy saving. And we have been working together to make sure that the incentives are there to save energy and to save money that can be spent on investing on renewable energies, for instance. And I think that is one way ahead, as long as with public procurements, that is another tool in our toolbox as a city.
And we all know, of course, here that Copenhagen is known for its carbon neutrality target. How close are you, and what's been the cost? And have you already calculated the positive return on this investment for the citizens of Copenhagen?
Well, we have been working on this, on becoming climate neutral since 2012, and we are supposed to reach it in 2025, I'm sorry. And by 2025, we are going to have reached it by 84%. So we're not quite there yet, but it's still, since the baseline was 2010, and we reduced since then 84%, we come along the way, but we're not quite there yet, so we are moving forward still. We are also making a new climate action plan for 2035, where we are moving from scope 1 and scope 2 to looking at scope 3, means that every Copenhagener's footprint is now we are going to take that into account. Because if you look at it only in a geographical way, like the UN way, and we look the benchmarking, Copenhagen is at the very front. I think every citizen is using around 1 ton of CO2 emission a year. But when you look at it as part of the rich global north, we're not even there. I mean, it's embarrassing.
You're not even there.
No, we're not even there. And,
well,
and it's embarrassing, and we need to take that into account. So this is kind of a new way to look at it. And if we're taking into the Copenhageners' CO2 footprints, partnerships, it's certainly what we're going to do, because as a municipality, we cannot tell our citizens to not drive the car with gasoline or not eating a beef or something like that. We have to work very closely together, and also closely together with business. And
we'll check in with you next year to see have you reached that goal. Best of luck with it. But let's go back to Peter there to hear more about investing in this change that is so much needed. What financial challenges and costs are involved in shifting from fossil fuels to renewables to power your mills? And what is your timeline?
Yeah, I mean, we've committed to this scientific target of maximum 1.5%, which means we have to reduce our carbon emissions by 2031 by more than 50%. And this means we have cut our carbon emissions since 2019 by about 25%. So we are in line with our target, but we need to spend, in our case, at around 600 million to finally get there. This is, of course, is a challenge.
And where exactly are you getting that money?
No, first of all, we earn the money. Or hopefully we earn the money, but we also, of course, have to take loans. And this leads me back to the question. Today, we don't see in practice a differentiation between, let's say now, an investment, as I said at the beginning, into renewable energy and any other investment which has no carbon advantage.
And does your ambition and also your transparency help in getting that money?
No, yeah, it's not a question. We finally do get the money because we're a solid company, but it's sometimes difficult to judge from a return point of view. So we invested a lot in photovoltaic, but then you see that we need obviously energy just at the time. So when we can use our photovoltaic, the electricity price is also at a low level, and so if you calculate it very thoroughly, you see that it's a pretty long payback time.
Absolutely.
That's obviously a problem.
Absolutely, indeed. And just going back over to you there, what stories can you share with us from successful investments in new technologies and perhaps as well from unsuccessful ones?
Okay, so maybe coming back to your earlier question about when do we want to be climate neutral in a diversified group like thyssenkrupp, we have different targets. We also committed to SBTi. Of course, some of our activities we will be climate neutral already in 2030 if you look at our material services business. But of course, if we look at our most polluting or most CO2 emitting part of our group, it's the steel making part. There we are currently investing 3 billion until 2027. In order to reduce over 600 million of CO2 emission. It's one of the largest industrial decarbonization projects worldwide. And as to your question, how the funding is taking place, of course, there's the money that we earn, there's the loans that we get, but there is, of course, also public funding, which CDP rating helps in terms of getting that done. It was a specific requirement we had in the discussions when getting the public money. And what I would like to point out, because I think it's important, coming back to my point to the network, we got 2 billion, it's not a secret, it was everywhere in the newspapers, we got 2 billion public funding to decarbonize our steelmaking industry. But more than 2/3 of that actually go in creating a hydrogen infrastructure, a green hydrogen infrastructure. And that will help the whole industry that we have in North Rhine-Westphalia in the western part of Germany. So I think it's important, again, coming to your point, that it's about cross-pollination also when public funding is taking part. So apart from decarbonizing our own activities, of course, we also have a lot of what we call enabling technologies. These are technologies we apply to help our customers to decarbonize, for example, in the cement industry, or building plants for green ammonium that can be a carrier of green energy. Also there, in terms of what can lawmakers do, what we see is that today the EU taxonomy is not fully serving its purpose. Yeah? Half of what we are investing is eligible. It's mainly our steelmaking investments, the change to the direct reduction plant, but many other things that we do are not EU eligible, EU taxonomy eligible, and I think that's also something we need to rethink. And I think an organization like CDP can be very instrumental there in pushing that change.
Indeed. We've talked, of course, a lot about climate, but what about nature? I mean, climate is just one part of the problem. There's also nature, which has been taken for granted for decades, has had no price. How can we address this systematic mispricing of biodiversity risk in the financial sector?
I think investing in nature needs to be seen more valuable as exploiting it. I mean, that's the simple answer. And I think traditionally, nature-based solution projects were funded by public money. We see now that the funding gap in nature-based solutions is so vast, public money cannot do it on its own. So we need to crowd in private sector money and other sources of funding. However, for the private sector, as many of you are coming from the private sector, you need a return. You need a return that you can measure, that you can also report back and have a profit on. But it's not always straightforward. So I think for the private sector to invest in nature-based solutions is still a new idea. We need to, by we, I mean governments, ADB works with governments, needs to make it easier for private sector to be able to measure the profits that are coming from nature-based solutions. We need to create the taxonomies that makes it measurable, and we need to have good projects that will pose a return. And just quickly, last year the ADB launched a Nature Solution Finance Hub at the last year's COP. And what this Nature-Based Solution Finance Hub is trying to do is, in fact, working with governments in order to create this enabling environment for the private sector to come into nature-based solutions. So this year we are preparing bankable projects, we are preparing pipelines for many countries, and we are also trying to understand what the risk barriers are for the private sector to come into nature-based solutions. And we are trying to help governments to make the case that it is worth coming in and you can have a return on your investment by investing in nature-based solutions.
Okay, very positive message there. Thank you for that. Because as it stands, 7 in 10 companies in Europe are dependent on at least one ecosystem device. So I'm curious, Peter, from your perspective, how does Group measure its dependence on nature?
Yeah, I mean, we are very dependent on nature because we use 2 raw materials. One is forests, and we're very proud that we work only with natural forests, also with mixed forests, both hardwood and softwood. And on the other hand, we produce a lot of products then with recycled material. So with the advantage we can use the material up to 25 times for our material. We don't get there quite because we have a recycling rate of around 86, 87%. So if you calculate this, it means we use it on the average 8 or 9 times, but this is still outstanding compared with many other recycling opportunities which exist in other industries. And so we also always say it's not about recyclability. I think that was over the last 10 years, it's now about recycling at scale. So it's not just important that you can recycle it, but do you recycle it? How often do you recycle it? And do you downcycle, or can you, I don't know the term, but can you recycle it into the same quality of product? And that's important for us.
Would you like to weigh in there?
No, I was just saying, you were saying downcycling, I was thinking upcycling. It's also for us, for example, already in 2016, we started a project to do a carbon capturing of our steel mill and use it then as a basic ingredient for ammonium or for methanol. So it again crosses different industries. So we talk about almost upcycling there because it used to be a waste and now it's being used.
And back to your perspective there from the Asian Bank, should taxes on high-impact businesses fund green policies, do you think, given increasing public debt and resistant as well to climate policy costs?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe not just exactly on taxes, but one project I like to use an example, and which France is actually has proposed last year at the Gabon Forest Summit. Maybe you're aware of it. It's debt for nature swaps. So where in order to, France has suggested, and ADB is supporting it, to work with governments to excuse their debts in return for investments in biodiversity and forests. Yeah.
I'd like to bounce that idea off you.
I was just nodding, but I can agree to it.
What about you, Peter?
Yes, I also agree.
Yeah. And yourself?
Well, we sure need funding for diversity, but we also need funding for the cities. And as I mentioned before, one part is getting financial and making green norms or CO2 taxations in Europe and other places. And I think we should move on making standards, good standards in European Union. But I really think that we ought to look more into some of the cities in the global south. How do they finance? Mm-hmm. And one thing is biodiversity, but some of them just lack common sense infrastructure when it comes to clean water, when it comes to energy, when it comes to, making sure that there's actually green infrastructure in transportation and everything like that. So just let's not forget that.
Yeah.
Let's not forget common sense. I mean, that's pretty practical advice.
Maybe on that one, in the Asia-Pacific region, we estimate that annually we need about $1.7 trillion for infrastructure. And that's not just for green. Green from that is 200 billion, right? There is still a need for what you just mentioned, water, urban, in transport, infrastructure to be built. But we need to do it through a climate lens. Everything needs to be, we cannot take off that glass anymore that everything needs to be green or as green as possible, with the sense of reality that we need to crowd in the private sector. There needs to be a profit for the private sector to come in. I mean, that cannot be forgotten. So in that light, ADB transformed itself last year to do a climate shift, because our EIB colleague has just mentioned that they transformed themselves to be the climate bank of the European Union. We have transformed ourselves to be the climate bank of the Asia-Pacific region. But we also need to transform ourselves to do a private sector shift. So in concomitantly to having done the climate shift, we are also transforming ourselves to be more private sector focused, and that our investments are also 30% private sector, because traditionally we've worked with sovereign borrowers.
I would just like to add to the infrastructure. I think one of the big challenges, especially for Europe, is electricity infrastructure. So with the renewable energy, it's great to have windmills, but it's intermittent. So you have it, you don't have it, so you have a lot of backup, and that means you need much better electricity network. I mean, we were testing, for instance, we wanted to install a photovoltaic farm, and then lead the electricity to our mill, and we were shocked. It was 3-4 times what the network could even provide. So we had, we have to build a direct line, and we see this problem across Europe. I mean, for the steel industry, that's a big topic, because you need mega infrastructure, and this infrastructure has to be paid for. And in many countries today, like in Germany and Austria, it's simply put onto the consumer. But if you calculate this, it will mean that the part just for the infrastructure will more than triple over the next 7 or 10 years. So this is a question then of how do you finance it? Should the end consumer finance it, which means business, families, etc.? Should we pay it from public funds? How do we do that? And actually, there is no discussion.
Well, we are having it now.
Yeah.
How should we do it? Give me the answer.
I don't know the answer, but the European Union has to find a coherent answer. And for instance, say we pay it from public money, or we give incentives, because at the moment it's not done because it cannot be financed, because the returns are too low. And so everyone says, until this is not decided, I don't invest. Yeah. So I think there isn't a goal now. I don't have the solution now, because someone has to pay for it, but we have to make this decision one way or the other. Otherwise there is no funding, otherwise the infrastructure doesn't go, and then we have great windmills, etc., but we have to turn them off because we cannot use the electricity.
That's the reality.
I agree totally, and I'm very worried also that in Europe that we have become so bureaucratic, you know, sometimes that even to put up new windmills now takes more than 10 years from the very project takes form until you have the liability and you actually can move forward. So financing is not the only problem here. The problem is also that, and we have made all these rules, and which is great, that we have to make sure that we don't get into all these kind of biodiversity issues. Of course, we need to have both the renewable